Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 34th Sir Henry Tizard lecture, Reimagining Human Flight with Richard Browning. It's a real shame we're not able to meet face to face, but I'm hoping that this is very much going to be the very next best thing, as we'll have a great opportunity to learn about a really fascinating new dimension to human flight. So here we are in lecture 2, just to give you an idea of what's coming ahead of us after tonight. We've got Roger Beasley on Operation Jericho. We've got the People's Mosquito team. We've got Norman Parker for our Christmas event showing the Secret Spitfires film. That's still provisional, but we're very much hoping to be able to do that. We've then got Dr. Steve Hodge from BAE Systems on flight simulation, Jamie Sayer from Kinetic on harmonization of drone regulations, and then, of course, we're looking forward to our major early careers event and student event, the Joe Morrill Award in March. And I'm delighted to be able to say that our winner from the Joe Morrill Award earlier this year did, in fact, go on to win the Main Society's NE-RO Award. So absolutely delighted that he went on to that success. So without further ado, on to tonight's speaker. So Richard is the founder and chief test pilot of Gravity Industries, and I understand he's going to share actually the journey that led to Gravity Industries and to where they are today. And this really does challenge the boundaries of flight, and there are some fascinating examples of how you go about safely testing and developing a completely new technology, which led to the founding of the company back in 2017 and now growing towards an international race series. As I'm sure Richard will relate, prior to founding Gravity Industries, Richard was a Royal Marines reservist and an oil trader with BP, but I'll leave him to talk about his background and the innovation that is Gravity Industries. Richard, delighted you could join us tonight. I'm very much looking forward to your lecture.
Thank you, Nick. Yes, so I will step everybody through a bit of a background to where the company's from, and some people might have seen some of that before, but then I'll swiftly move on to some of the more recent things we've done, and then open it out to Q&A, and I can hear people's ideas, challenges, thoughts and things, and that's usually the more fun part. But let me first of all, let's see if I can share my screen. Now I'm going to go for the conservative option here. I'm going to share the slide pack and not run it, because it seems like roughly 50% of the people can't see this when we try and run this. So I'm going to run it as it is, actually slide by slide, if that works for people. So do somebody shout if this is not coming through. So I'm going to share a little bit of background beyond what you've already seen, which is my whole family was from the world of aviation and engineering. So my grandfather on my mother's side was Sir Basil Blackwell, who used to run Westlands before it became Leonardo's. His father was an aeronautical engineer and pilot. My father was an aeronautical engineer, and I've got a fun little film here, very much a VHS film of showing he and I flying 2-channel gliders. This is Corton Hill on the approach to Yeovilton. If you're if you fly into Yeovilton, then you tend to buzz this hill depending on the wind direction. So I spent many happy hours chucking gliders off there, learning the hard way about how you can learn from failures or not, as depending on how well you build the glider in the first place. So it really, in hindsight, that experience, I think, was a small part of, a significant part of my inspiration behind what I've gone on and done. But another large part of it, as was mentioned, I was in the Royal Marines Reserve for about 6 years, but I used to do things like ultramarathons and something mysterious called calisthenics, which, if I click on the right slide, there's a demonstration here of calisthenics. So this is something, to be honest, I got into this after the Royal Marines. I used to film my lunch breaks at BP when I managed to escape the trading floor, going off and doing crude versions of this kind of activity, basically using your balance and core strength and, I suppose, a sort of gymnastic skill to try and achieve these kind of unusual feats. And I think that's a significant part of this journey, because it taught me a lot about how amazing the human kind of mind is, firstly, to balance something like the position you can see him holding there, and also how you can you can train human physicality to do something as structurally terrible as that. You can see he's supporting himself just with his hands in a sort of press-up position. So you've got a horrendous cantilever with the back of the body being unsupported like that. It's amazing the shoulders can take that. So if I mash together the family background, a genuine passion and intrigue in flight, and I suppose a career-long desire to go and challenge boundaries, and whenever people say things can't be done, I have to say I do take a keen interest in wondering why that is. And you put all that together, I hatched this idea back in 2016 that could you not sort of challenge the status quo thinking around human flight and go back to the sort of raw principles of just adding the missing component to the human body, which is power. I'm not mad enough to think you can flap your way to this outcome. But could you not just add the minimalist amount of technology to fill in the missing power component and still use human balance and physicality to fly? And with no business idea, rationale, anything like that, I set about that in 2016. And I suppose the starting point was this little moment here. We'll test the sound now. Hopefully that should be quite quiet. This was March 2016, standing in a lane in Wiltshire with a micro turbojet bolted to an aluminium tube. The fuel tank was sitting in the bucket. That's not an open bucket of fuel. That's not quite that crazy. This had come about after about 3-4 weeks or so of playing around with those engines, trying to get my head around, essentially the risk profile of what they represented. How dangerous were they to be around? What were the issues associated with them? How could you quickly shut them down? What did the thrust generation look like and things like that? But it was a big step to go to actually essentially hold on to one with that assembly. And yet the learning was quite profound. It was a spongy, really quite gentle yet forceful experience. So if you imagine a fire hose propelling water out of it at about 100 miles an hour, it would feel similar to that, even though in this case the air is coming out at about 1,000 miles an hour. Obviously the density difference makes all the difference there. And so if you closed your eyes and did that, you would feel like you were really holding onto that fire hose. There was no gyroscopic moment. There was no kind of flailing around. I mean, why should there be when you really think about it? Because the fire hose is not, unlike a fire hose, this hasn't got a great big long attachment attached to it. I can stabilize the compressor end and just point it where I want. And it actually, I suppose, convinced me that this power source, as it were, had some real promise. So having gone from one, at least in my mind, logical step was to go to two. So it's really just the same thing. And now I've got a fuel tank on my back and now one engine slung above each arm. There was quite a lot of torque around your arm, but at least, you could play around with it. And it was a lot more balanced than having one. And to be clear, each one of those engines weighs about 2 kilos and puts out about 22 kilos of thrust, which is, quite a phenomenal ratio. From there, you can see the trajectory where we're going here. This is now 4, and this was great because this is actually really quite balanced. I mean, the net thrust felt like it was just going up your arms. And this is without any splay, any of the clever geometry we've got nowadays. It was actually quite pleasant. And that's still not enough power to get me off the ground. I weigh about the same as the thrust those things can put out, but obviously we're then adding the weight of the engines and the fuel. What you really needed to get to was 6 of them. But the question was, where would you put the other 2? In the pursuit of that, we played around with all sorts of things like this, where you can see now I've gone back to one on each arm and stuck one on each leg with the idea that your legs are load bearing. That's a sort of tick in the box there, but they are no way as precise and dexterous as your arms. You are somewhat on autopilot, walking and running. And you only really realize that when you then try and attach some thrust to them and point them in a helpful direction. That moment as well, you can see we were also trying a sort of tether system. That really didn't work very well because until you've got a decent amount of balanced thrust, that tether point becomes essentially a 5th unpredictable vector, which made the learning really quite difficult. So slightly reluctantly, I did away with that and just, I suppose, put up with falling a few feet onto that farmyard. This was an experiment of trying to achieve the 6 engines, but all 6 on the arms. It was kind of mad, and you can see by the lack of glow on the outer engines, I wasn't really gunning the outer ones particularly, but it was just too difficult, but very much in the spirit of kind of learning from experimentation. So even though here, this is a clip of showing only one on each arm, this was the sort of learning process of giving yourself that little moment in the air. Horrendous amount of dust and FOD there, I have to say. I mean, they did have covers on, but not fine enough to filter that rubbish. Anyway, this is actually quite interesting to watch for me now, because we've had over 400 commercial and military and paramedic clients learn to do flying to varying degrees with us at our Goodwood facility, and we get them to do little repeated hops. So you'll see I'm very pleased with myself here because I didn't fall over. We get them to do little repeated hops like that because it gives you a safe moment in the air to feel whether you're balanced or not. So it's quite interesting for me to watch back and see. It's kind of what I was doing then, but without the luxury of a tether. Anyway, that kind of arrangement really started to work pretty well. And you can see here 2 on each arm now and 1 on the back of each leg. It was just a question of trying to tune your brain. So it's very much a, patting your head and rubbing your stomach kind of problem. You can see I've got this awful rotation problem, trying to counter the rotation. And then as soon as your feet feel like they're off the ground, you bend your knee. I don't know why your brain wants to do that, but you bend your knee and you just end up rotating. But by November of that same year, so if I started in March 2016, and this is all alongside a day job and just endlessly iterating and trialing, we managed to do this. Still shaking, or fighting my shaking, wobbling, twisting right leg there, but I managed to stick that very meager 6-second little flight, and it worked. And that was the kind of pivotal point where this ludicrous little experiment in the weekends and evenings turned into something where I was convinced that if that could work, it was only going to be a question of just endlessly improving it. And just to kind of reinforce this point, there's a nice little show reel here which shows you kind of how far we've come. This is a smattering of some of the 140 events in 35 countries now. I just come back from a NATO exercise in Slovenia a couple of weeks ago. But it's nice just to highlight just how far this has come compared to where we were in that farmyard. And you'll notice instead of having the engines on the back of the legs, they progressed up to my posterior and then consolidated into one larger one which sits between the fuel bladders on your back. You can see it in some of the clips, but fundamentally the layout of propulsion on each arm, let's turn this music down, propulsion on each arm and one on the back creates this kind of tripod of support. So if you simplify the arms down to each arm being a thrust vector, because that's what it feels like, it feels very much like you're just leaning on a work surface. That third leg of the tripod is your back, is that thrust vector intersecting somewhere up between your shoulder blades, and it comes extremely naturally. It feels not dissimilar to the balance instinct you have if you stumble to one side. What do? You put your arm out to that side looking for a surface to lean on. Well, the same instinct applies here, except now you've got those surfaces anywhere you like. And so as a result, a lot of the people who come and train with us, and you'll see in a second, you'll see that was one of our old training rigs, and a rather overdone location, frankly. This little film here shows you more of the setup we use nowadays at Goodwood. So you're on a top rope, which means you can't stumble and fall over. You have a remote control system to control the power and go to shut down or idle. And really, you just start on way too little power to do anything. And those little hops, like you saw me do in that farmyard, you're starting to tune your brain. And you do it all in the comfort of knowing that really, if you get it wrong, you just twizzle around. That tether keeps you safe. Even my 14-year-old can do this now, which kind of answers the question, is it really hard to do? Because he's a typical skinny 14-year-old. So he's got the rotation wrong there, but look, never mind, just lets go of the trigger, stands back in the middle again and has another go. And then you see, this is the same guy by the afternoon. That rope's still there, but he's increasingly not relying on it, and he's starting to actually maneuver around. And then you progress from there onto this zip line. You can see it slung up in the right-hand side of the shot. And there you really can fly around where it's as if, it still needs to work on it a bit. You really can fly around as if you're flying free, but knowing that zip line's there to catch you. It's the process is not dissimilar to watching kids learn to ride bikes in a way. You can't really explain it beyond a point. You just have to feel it and just kind of do that action and reaction learning sort of process. We have sold a couple of these suits, but when we do, we still keep them on our premises. Our main focus is professional users outside of the members of the public coming and having a play, and potentially graduating into the RAeS series, which was mentioned earlier. It's more about professional users, and that's particularly the military and paramedic world. So there's a film which I'd be willing to bet a fair few of you probably have caught sight of. And this is really the culmination of almost a dozen military exercises around the world now. And like I say, one of the two recent ones, one was with the Italian Special Forces. We haven't launched or revealed that film yet. But the other one was with NATO in the Mountain Warfare School in Slovenia, which was quite cool. We should have a film going out with that soon. But this was the Royal Marines boarding exercise film, which kind of speaks for itself, really. The idea of getting an initial team onto the bridge deck of that ship. It took me 17 seconds from that position, ludicrous position, frankly, on the bow of that PAC-24. It took me 17 seconds when it took, even allowing for the failed hook on first, even if we discount that, it took the traditional boarding teams with hooks and poles more like 2 minutes to get there, and then you're climbing with no top cover. Whereas we can obviously relocate on target, we can self-extract, we can do all sorts of stuff. And in case it comes up as a question, if you're inbound to the target and somebody does spot you, then there is a shoulder-mounted, helmet-steered weapon system, which we built just to address that concern. But realistically, you shouldn't need that. You should be flying into target where there's no imminent threat pointing a weapon at you. So yeah, I mean, that I'm gonna cut it short there. If you haven't seen that film, it's all over the Gravity Industries YouTube channel. But that's a good example of some of the military stuff we've done. The paramedic side of things, if I let this play out whilst I talk. So think of a paramedic on a motorbike. Think of first responder, cuts through the traffic, gets to the casualty, sorts out bleeding, blood flow, breathing, all of those kind of things, stabilizes the situation, sorts out pain, and then triages and reports back to base as to what the situation is. That's what we can do in a mountainous environment. So the scenario is, you know, car turns up much quicker than the helicopter because they're based at the base of these valleys. You put that equipment on, and I got there. It was actually me flying it, although that guy looks like we're going to be doing a sponsored deal with a big corporate to actually train up him and another paramedic to be operational in the summer. But it was me flying it, to be honest. I got there in 90 seconds, when it took over 20 minutes to walk there from the same vehicle. And the Dartmoor exercise we just did was even more stark. It was 70 seconds to fly there, and it took 35 minutes to walk. So, you know, you're not going to be flying the casualty between your legs to hospital or anything silly like that, but it is a pretty amazing first response system. I'm going to, again, I imagine some of you might have seen this before. Again, it's on the Gravity Industries YouTube if you want to see it, but you get the idea, I'm sure. I just kind of cover all the aspects to kind of what this slightly unusual business does now. So we obviously try to use this as best we can as a bit of a platform to, I'm sure like you guys, try and promote, you know, the career path of engineering. You know, there's nothing more powerful that we found than landing a 1,000 horsepower jet suit in the middle of a school, obviously when you're invited, and that tends to get people's attention. You know, and I think it's quite a nice, very visual, impactful, obviously looks a little bit like a superhero as well. That's not an unhelpful thing when it comes to the kids and some of the adults. I think it's quite a powerful medium to try and deliver that, I suppose, physical manifestation of what innovation's all about, and I'm quite passionate about that. There is a slide in here. I'm frankly going through my sort of master slide pack here so I don't miss anything out, but I can choose when I skip over things. We do seems ridiculous covering this one with you guys, with a lot of, whether they're corporates or whether they're kids groups. When I do keynotes around the world, they always ask, have you ever thought about building an Iron Man suit? And in case any of you asked that question or want to touch on that subject, this is the famous Adam Savage of Mythbusters fame, built a 3D printed titanium Iron Man suit. Nearly all of that was titanium, ludicrously enough. And we had a bit of fun training Adam to fly, and then it was my job to see if I could fly that ludicrous creation, even with the eye covers in as well. So I could see out of the corner of one eye. It's amazing how your seat of your pants and your inner ear work out the fill in the gaps. And yeah, and it did fly. And they spent, being Americans, they spent the next day when we'd left shooting at that chest plate with pretty heavy caliber weapons, and it did prove to be ballistically capable, except the shrapnel dug straight into the shoulders of the ballistic dummy. So I'm glad they didn't try and do that with me wearing it. But there we go, silly exercise really, but it did fly. It was stupidly heavy, and landing it was hard because I couldn't really get a decent bead on the ground, so I just had to flare until you sort of felt the ground should be coming, and then just wince as the unbending leg assemblies just sent all the shock straight up your body. That applies to landing on that stage as well. I couldn't really see where it was, so I thought I'd just work it out and then just lower. Helpfully edited film to show me not stumbling around too much. I'll just wait till it shows the landing because it brings back memories. Oh, don't want to let go of the power too early. From an R&D point of view, I mean, we can cover more of this when we do Q&A, but I mean, we massively use 3D printing. Some of the noise in the background is our little filament printer whirring away doing a latest FOD mesh test we want to run. But we used to use aluminium sintering, you know, the SLS aluminium printers a lot, but we've now gone to polypropylene because it's a lot cheaper and much more bendy. So if you fall over, it's quite nice that the structure of the whole suit now has a bit of give in it. And the heat problems, we've managed to be clever enough with them to the extent where we don't need the aluminium anymore. So we actually, you know, happily make do with polypropylene, which is always a surprise to when people think that, you know, there's going to be a huge heat problem. From a wing testing point of view, so I've got some fun little films in here. In fact, I just updated one of the slides, which I'll get to in a minute. There was a theory right from the quite early days, at least in my mind, that wouldn't it be nice to transition from the VTOL stage to aerodynamic lift? So I'm thinking Harrier F-35 type process, because if you did transition to a decent amount of aerodynamic lift, then you could use that as a mechanism to survive not so much the rear engine problems. They're not so bad if they happen, but arm engines, you've got a real asymmetry problem. So you only really want to go fast or high over water. However, if you're generating decent aerodynamic lift, then why not try and lean on that? And then, you know, if you had one engine failure on one arm side, then shut down the corresponding one on the other side using aerodynamic lift. And we played around with all sorts of things. I throw this one in there because I'm sure it'll make you smile. So rather than mess around with booking wind tunnel time, which we have done before, why not just turn Wiltshire, or in that case, Old Sarum, into a bit of a wind tunnel? That is a tremendously aggressive angle of attack experimental wing on the back of our truck, which we don't have any longer. But it turned out that truck can drive very quickly backwards, and there was a quite nice way of getting some idea of airflow without having to actually fly it. This film here, I'm going to run a bit of this. It's in here because this film's done 30 million views on YouTube for some reason, and I think it's because Google picked it up, and I think it's because it's sunny, to be honest. It shows you some of our wing testing, and you can see the wing quite close. This is really as far as we got. So it's a RAeS Air Leg Wing with strakes on the side. The angle of attack is pretty pathetic, to be honest. It's more of a wind deflector than a wing at this speed anyway. But it has quite a profound effect because it lifts your body to a steeper angle. The rear engine increasingly becomes a propulsive device rather than a lift device. You're still very much leaning on your arms, but you get to such speeds that you do start to feel like you can control your motion by actually the airflow over the arm assemblies rather than where the arm assemblies are pointing. And learning in real time with this has been quite fascinating. Yeah, and one big learning was that, yeah, you can see me banking a little bit around there. I'm starting to actually learn to fly it like an aerodynamic structure more than just a vectored thrust process. So it's quite funny as you transition between the two. And as I say, I've done all that sort of live in real time, which is so much is going on. You only really digest the learnings usually a day or so later. It's a kind of a weird sort of decompression thing going on. Using this setup, and particularly those leg strakes, which really help with directional stability. You're quite a bathroom tile otherwise. We managed to set the Guinness World Record for Guinness World Records Day. This is a film which is quite fun because two of my team were flying either side of me to sort of see me off, as it were. And we set, I think it was 85 miles an hour, about 135 kilometers an hour. I don't really want to repeat it too much. I mean, we set up the flotation system that it would keep you floating and float the right way up if you knocked yourself out hitting the water, which I think there's a fair chance you would doing that speed. And it's all pretty low, so you should skim and rather than, you know, impact too heavily. But yeah, I'm pleased we've done it, but I don't want to keep doing that too much. Like I say, it starts to get outside of the risk envelope that I enjoy. I'm going to throw this. So anyway, you can see we ran several of those runs. This film, I just discovered this recently. I'll turn the volume down a bit. This is a nice one. This is really kind of flying with a beautiful wind speed. I don't know if you noticed. Let me just run that back a second. If you notice how I learned to. Oh, this is going to be interesting. I'm not sure. I have to maybe start again in a minute. I learned how to turn those strakes out. So you point your toes downwards, and I had struts running to the tips of the strakes. So you can generate more or less lift with the strakes. They're now in tail fin mode, but that is just, I mean, I'm being chased by an FPV drone here who's struggling to kind of match me, but that is an amazing feeling. That is properly aerodynamically banking round the corner. He'll catch me back up again in a minute. That is a phenomenal feeling. And I'm pretty flat there until I have to start forward vectoring, turn the power back up to be able to come back into a sort of VTOL landing. That's the hairiest part. If you forget to turn the power back up, you just realize you haven't got enough VTOL thrust to properly make it back. There you go, I slightly overshot and then come back in and land on the pad. Whoa, dear, there we go. I'll just run the very beginning again. If you watch it for a second, and about my feet, now, there, you could actually really control those little strakes. Anyway, I'm sure we can pick up that in the questions. So one of the things we were doing with this, apart from the military and search and rescue work and client training and events and all sorts of other media stuff, racing these is something that, frankly, is just massive fun. This is some relatively slow overland stuff we did to show, other than recirculation from your other pilot, you can get really quite close to other pilots, and it's quite fun sort of nipping around. As I say, this is not particularly fast because it was over hard standing there and over grass off to the side, but yeah, you can sort of dance around in the air really close to other pilots, and it is massive fun. There's something really enthralling about being in the air at the same time as other people. It is sort of otherworldly. So I'm going to cut that one short because this film here was the location we should have been launching our March 2020 race series. No prizes for guessing what happened to that, being March 2020. And we were going to launch it in Bermuda. And this is a film we did when I was out doing a TED Talk in Bermuda, which is what somewhat inspired the location. I mean, you can guess why we wanted to race there. I mean, it's such a stunning place and beautiful water. And this was more wing testing, actually. But yeah, this is where we were going to be launching the race series. And I'm pretty confident we'll get there. We just got to wait until the world sorts itself out from a COVID perspective. But you can imagine taking a leaf out of the motor racing world's book in terms of, branded sponsored teams, previous successful athletes from other worlds turning their hand to racing. We're even going to have hopefully some of the special forces we've trained and paramedics we've trained coming and trying their hand and competing as well. Doing it all over water with inflatable pylons, so really there's nothing can go wrong, but it'll look pretty dramatic and spectacular. Yeah, and I'm really looking forward to the day when we can actually kind of get that together. But as I say, that's one of the things that's taken a little bit of a backseat thanks to COVID. I've rattled through most things pretty quickly. I am going to show you one thing which I'm sure you'll enjoy, which is some of the fails, because our ethos with this whole journey, and it's somewhat come from, I suppose from a time growing up around my father and my whole family around the engineering world, but also frankly from running a trading book. And running a trading book, you have to constantly take risk. You have to constantly try things which a good number of them won't work out, and you learn very quickly that that's fine. You just have to deal with what not working out means. And if not working out means you're going to irreparably damage your reputation, your finances, or most importantly for our journey, yourself, and you don't or can't get back up again and have another go, then in my old trading world, that means you'd get shut down and lose your job and not be running a trading book anymore. In our world, that means you break your legs and you're not going to get to have another go at trying whatever it was that failed. So our ethos is very much one of not being afraid to take the risk as long as that risk is survivable. So all the fails I'm going to show you now are examples of sometimes slightly bruising, but none of them catastrophic. None of the clips I've shown you, we've been very high. We just choose not to fly high because that breaches that rule set. So here we go. Here's a little collection of, there's a few missing from this. Some of these are very early days. That was a quite violent one, but that was running out of fuel, that one on the trailer. That was banking too hard and not having our power nudge system. That was letting go of the throttle trigger and not realizing I was still doing 20 miles an hour forward speed, which was a challenge. Nothing wrong with the equipment. That was one of my old pilots who just bottled it. That was a compressor stall on a very muggy day, which is fascinating. You saw it create a cloud momentarily. We had a couple of fails in Bournemouth, the air show, but we pushed the engines at absolute 100% to sort of see what would happen. Maybe it wasn't a good idea to do it publicly, but you know what? It demonstrated that actually, look, there you go. That's the worst that happens if you fall in the water. That was in the Maldives. They contaminated my fuel with fabric conditioner. That was another one of my team. Nothing wrong with the equipment. He just didn't power up as he banked, much the same as a normal aircraft. This is a repeat of the same learning, this time in Belgrade, I think it was. There we go. Watch my colleagues spiral in. All the equipment floats, and we wear a life jacket on top of that. There we go. There's one of my colleagues. That was a race test event. There we go. It's my CAD designer going in head first. If you jump too hard or too early without having enough thrust, then you don't do a superhero launch. You just fall over. That was Armed Forces Day in Salisbury. That was an unfortunate one. That was an air bubble in the fuel line. That was a good learning opportunity and a quite well-placed ramp at the Goodwood Festival of Speed. There we go. There's been a few more since then, actually, which I need to update. Anyway, I think that is about me. I've probably gone through that pretty quickly. I much prefer fielding questions and having a bit more of an open debate, because I think we've been around for quite a while now, and some of what I've probably shown you is already familiar to a good number of you. So I will pause there. I will stop sharing my screen and invite questions, if I can work out how to stop sharing my screen. There we go. There we go. I should be back.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Richard. It's been absolutely fascinating. There's no better way of telling the story than taking us through the visuals from the very early days right through to where you've got to today. So just a reminder to all those watching that you can submit your questions through our Q&A feature, and I'll then pick them up and ask Richard. So whilst you're doing that, the great thing about sharing these events, I get to ask the first question. So, Richard, one thing I'm fascinated by is that you've got a device here that is clearly capable of killing the user, and yet you've managed to get this far with only, as you say, a few bruises and some bumps. And what I'm just really interested in is, how did you define the envelope within which you would operate, and how did you go about expanding that?
Yeah, I mean, my initial response to your first point, and you're very right, it's the same with a car or a motorbike or anything that flies. It's very easy to kill yourself with any of those things. But it just depends on how you operate them. I think one of the nice things about how we fly these, or how this system works, is that it can't fail upwards. So unlike the growing community of drone type things, which have gyros and ECUs and flight computers, we've also seen drones go pretty crazy, and they can fail upwards and off to the side with a lot of violence. Because we're flying with vectored thrust, even if all of those engines go 120% in sort of nameplate thrust, I can stand on the ground. You just flare them out to the sides. So you are a bit like with a motorbike, sit on a 100 horsepower motorbike and you accelerate into a wall at easily 150 miles an hour within seconds, but it's all your choice. I mean, actually, a motorbike's worse, arguably, because whilst you have human control of the steering, you could have that over throttle, I suppose, whereas we just can't do that. So that's a nice thing I think that's worth throwing out there straight away. And because you're vectored thrust flying, you can terrain hug very precisely and operate on any surface pretty much. You can take off with them pointed to the side and then just flash them down and jump up and go. So to answer your question, I mean, very simply, when you stand on a step ladder, you always feel like you're much higher than the observer sees you standing. And so that helpful human trait keeps you quite safe. When you're flying with your feet a meter above some grass, your brain goes, good Lord, this all feels quite high. I don't fancy falling from this height. So you actually, as the pilot, and this is why we train everybody, whether it's our team or clients or military or paramedics, we train them on that training rig, and we have to see them get bored, frankly, with flying up and down a zip wire system that's slack. So it's as if they're free, and we can see that the moment something doesn't feel right, their instinct is flare and to land. And we can see if they have a propensity to fly high or to fly fast or anything like that. And we kill out those behaviors early on. So it's a bit like making sure your motorcycle rider is not a bit of a lunatic when, given the opportunity. It's really that. And you make the judgment according to what the surface is and what the speed is, and keep yourself in that way, safe in that way.
Great. That's a really good explanation. Thank you very much, Richard. That's and a testament to that development that you're able to bring people on in the way you've talked about. Okay, I now have another question.
Can I jump in with one, Nick?
Go.
So yeah, it's Jeff Clarkson. I was a bit late joining, but I'm the vice chairman as well. But one thing that really fascinated me, and I guess a lot of people are asking, is how do you actually control the device? I mean, I got the impression there are some kind of throttle levers, but how do you know what's going on, I guess, is the simple question.
Yeah, very good question. So so just to be clear, 2 engines on each arm, engine on the back, but let's think of that as 3 thrust vectors, because it feels like there's a thrust vector on each arm, really, very nicely balanced. You're just leaning on those engines. You have a throttle trigger in your right arm, which means that if you squeeze the throttle and hold it down, it goes to the power you pre-selected. If you let go, they drop back to idle. So if you fall over or you don't like anything, it's like a dead man's handle. You let go, and on idle, they're very lame. You know, you can point them. If you were stupid, you could point them a meter away from somebody on idle, and it's just warm and unpleasant. You know, it's a very low power level, if that makes sense. Next to your throttle trigger, there is a button which now, unlike in the early days, if you touch when they're on idle, they shut down. In the early days, if you touched it when they were on full power, they would also shut down, so you don't want to touch that one. In fact, in the very early days, I used to have to hold the button down constantly whilst I was flying, and if I let go of it, it would shut down. That's how kind of risk averse I was, but perversely, as the flying got more and more capable, that became a bigger risk of slipping off the button, which never happened. But and then very simply, in the other arm assembly, there is a rocker switch. So these 2 fingers, the switch rocks up and down, and every click gives you about 1 kilo more thrust spread across all 5 engines. And think of that as a trim switch. So when you start your flight, you start up the engines. They only take about 15 seconds to go up to idle now, which is terrifying. And you think, well, OK, what's the weather like? It's maybe a warm day. I'll nudge up, and you can see on a pendant system down here. We used to use a heads up display. It's too much faff. You just look down at a screen. It's much easier. And you go, I know, I'll nudge it up to 80% today because I want an aggressive launch, and it's quite warm, and I've got a little bit more fuel than usual. And as you go squeeze that trigger and then vector down as the power has built, you should, with a little blip of your foot just to give yourself that initial inertial launch, you don't have to, but it's neater to do it, you should bite and launch at about an angle that feels natural. I mean, I'll stand up and, you know, that rather than that, or rather than that. That bit of information is vital, because as you then launch and you go, oh my goodness, I launched very aggressively, you think actually maybe it wasn't quite such a warmer day. I'm getting a bit more thrust from slightly cooler air. You know, and as you then fly, you can then keep adjusting and trimming the power. You want an optimum where your arms aren't really wide. That would be the case if you've got too much power, and they're not really down to your sides, because if you suddenly need a burst of lift, like when you're banking, you saw those guys fall in the water. They just needed to nudge a couple of clicks, like changing gear on a mountain bike before a hill, to give themselves more vectorable lift, if that makes sense. That was a long answer to your question, but that hopefully covers how you fly.
So I suppose the only other very quick one is how do you know how much fuel you've got or how long you've got?
So the pendant system now tells you what we've kept this as simple and as foolproof, hopefully, as possible. It simply says how much has been burnt. None of this like conversion into how many minutes left and the possibility of not knowing what you started with and all this stuff. It just simply says how many liters you've burnt. Our default is you put 10 liters in pretty much every single time. And then you just know that's a couple of minutes with some safety margin. And most of the time we're only flying for a minute or so. And you just look down at the pendant. I have to say, again, in the early days, we didn't used to have a pendant, and I could time a minute if you asked me within a second, because of the fear generated ability to learn exactly what the minute felt like from doing events. And to be clear, we always had stupid amounts of fuel excess. You know, just in case you got that wrong. And even in the early days, you used to have somebody in the audience who put up a flag when they'd gone over it, when you've gone a minute or whatever, just to be absolutely sure. So flying by time rather than relying on some, you guys probably know better than I do, but trying to measure fuel volume in a bladder is a real pain and lots of opportunity for screw up. So just fly by time.
Great. That's fantastic. Thanks very much. Nick, I'll check it back to you.
No, thank you. And so does that mean that effectively that everything you've done has been within that span of a couple of minutes?
Yeah, I mean, I've done flight tests before up to nearly 5 minutes. It just gets boring after a while, to be honest. It's not what we've built is not designed to be a long haul, you know, let's go for 20 minutes in this direction. It is designed to be like a sort of dirt bike of the skies, you know, a dirt scramble bike. You don't go and commute on it. You go tearing around a 3-dimensional space for a few minutes with unprecedented accuracy, nimbleness and aggression. That's what this system allows you to do. So if you need to go a kilometre that way, land, stow the engines, do a task, then suddenly take the engines back, accelerate and step off within a second and go again and go a kilometre back again and still have enough fuel to repeat that whole exercise again. That's the kind of thing we do. You know, it's not traveling in a long distance or really competing with helicopters in any way.
Got it. I'm fascinated because I'm an aerodynamicist by background. They're trying to get the transition right, and so I guess my question is, firstly, what have you learnt about trying to get that right, and secondly, where do you think you're going to end up?
Yeah, so frankly, it's just been absolutely fascinating. So it's a really interesting basket of problems. The simplest solution, you know, the simplest thing that we've had the most success with, as you wouldn't find too surprising, is that RAeS Air Leg Wing, for a number of reasons. It's really simple. You can make it go away by closing your legs again, and you've suddenly not got it anymore. But when you open your legs and the scoops fill it up, you suddenly feel that lovely lift come up. Because I'm quite a square shape, I don't have much linear stability. So therefore, putting those strakes on, which are really, I guess, you know, they're a bit like tail fins. They at least keep my head going in the direction I want to be going in, and it does feel so much more stable. That all has worked quite well, and you do notice a real efficiency. You actually end up nudging the power down 5 or 6, 7, 8 kilos easily as you come up into that transition, and so you're now cruising much faster and using less power because you're getting that aerodynamic lift, very crudely. So it's fun when you come back out like a flying squirrel before you hit the tree. It's fun when you have to nudge the power up and regain that aerodynamic stability, that VTOL stability again. The challenge we've had is trying to get any decent, stable aerodynamic lift on the upper body. So think Yves Rossi. I went to see Yves with my team only a few weeks ago when we were coming back from Italy. And, you know, looking at his enormous crude single wing like that, very far down the body around his C of G, you know, he said to me that, you know, above 150, 200 kilometers an hour, it starts to get sweet, and it really needs about 250 kilometers an hour, and then it really is dialed in. And then you get to 300 and 350, and then it feels like your head's getting crushed into your neck, and so that's your window. And it just reinforced what we've learned, which is that the speeds we're going at, let's say 100, 110, 120 kilometers an hour, the airflow isn't enough with the size of wings we're playing with to generate smooth enough, dominant enough airflow to say that you're under aerodynamic lift, because there's a gap, I think. We're not willing to vector ourselves to a speed required safely to be able to get a safe amount of aerodynamic lift. And just by making the wing bigger, it just became such a handful, because I don't have aerodynamic controls. And maybe we need a little gyro stabilizing flight computer to play with the ailerons and a crude elevon maybe to try and do some of that stabilizing work. But that already sounds pretty scary, to transition us towards that moment where you go, OK, I'm now flying as an aircraft. We've only scraped the surface of it with that lower leg wing. You know, you're hitting little bits of turbulence at 80, 90 kilometers an hour with a big wing on your back is quite scary. You know, you suddenly gain 20 meters in a second, and all you've got is these arms with a lot of power, but your only option is to vector forward and drop out the airflow. Does that sort of explain it a bit?
No, it's really interesting, because I guess what you've got me thinking about is do you think anybody could ever bridge that gap to what Yves doing, and to get you something that could actually go from jet-borne flight to fully wing-borne flight at his kind of speeds? Yes,
I mean, there's several ways of doing it. One is just have the carefree attitude that has killed one of Yves's colleagues in Dubai about a year ago, and it was not on Yves's watch, that, to be clear. That was Dubai and the media machine there that pushed it further than Yves was willing to go. But that guy died playing in this sort of realm, so that's a pretty salient, you know, lesson there. So yes, just having a disregard for safety, but that's not an option for us. The other one is to have, I think, essentially a little gyro stabilized flight computer, like I say, but it would be like being a jet suit pilot with an radio controlled aircraft on your back that just desperately tries to keep level all the time, no matter what you do to it. I think that would work, but it terrifies me, because if it goes wrong and does, you know, if the needle transitioning from vector thrust flight to aerodynamic flight is now really shifting to aerodynamic, and the machine is doing that for you, and then it has a bad day out and goes max elevator and you just climb. You know, I've experienced little bits of that before when I've been doing it, and that's bad enough, but let alone when a machine does it. I don't think I want to do that, really. The only other way I could think of doing it, and we are experimenting with this, I've not told anybody publicly yet we're doing this, is auto gyros. So imagine an auto gyro wing, you know, which is renowned, and I've flown one just to get my head around this, renowned for being unstallable, as long as it doesn't come off, unstallable and dumb, and just wants to be a lift disc behind you. Maybe, just maybe, that's progressive enough that you can incrementally edge your way into that aerodynamic lift zone in a way that feels safe and sustainable. Do you know what I mean? And worst case scenario is you're just sycamoring down into some water and having a think about your failure. I don't know. That's my best guess at the moment. It's frustrating because you can see the opportunity is massive, right? You could go immense speeds and yet quite safely when you're there, because you'd be under aerodynamic lift. You could lose all your engines and have some gliding ability still over water, but then come in and stall and plop into the water and it should all be all fine. But it's a scary thing. Yeah, we're not just going to throw ourselves at it. As you credited me earlier, you know, we've done this for 5 years now without anybody hurting themselves more than getting a bit bruised every now and then. And I want to keep it like that.
Yeah, that's fascinating, Richard, and some real challenges there. I just wanted to go to some of the other questions that have been asked, actually. Yes, the mountain rescue role has clearly caught the imagination. And the question is, what sort of payload weight do you think you could actually carry in that role?
Yeah, so really, and again, your audience here will know this immediately, you know, ask the same question of a helicopter. You know, it's how big our engine, how big a rotor disc, what altitude you're flying at, what fuel load, what range, you know, all of those things. So the same thing applies to this. So those two, so there's two Mark 2.5s in the background, there and there. They are able to lift, let's say, an 80 kilo person with a 20 kilo payload with 4 minutes of fuel on a 20 degrees centigrade day at sea level. There you go. Now start messing with any of the rest of the variables and it all changes. But we can easily upscale the engines on that. And the next version is going to be another 20 kilos of payload lift out of the box. And if you put that on a 100 kilo US Marine, suddenly it looks tiny and you could probably go even bigger again. I think we'll get to a world where you have almost different sized suits, frankly, mostly down to what your body size is, but also down to what job you're doing. If you really want to carry a ton of equipment, military or paramedics, then just put a slightly bigger diameter centrifugal compressor onto the engines and you end up with more power. So I'm not daunted by the problem, but the headline answer to your question is around 20 kilos or so. Right.
And that's interesting. That's more or less by your ability to carry that level of weight on top of maintaining control, I take it, rather than the restrictions of the engines themselves.
I mean, you're roughly taking 2/3 of your body weight on your arms. You can do a fun experiment. If you stand on the bathroom scales and then lean forward with straight arms, like you're just having a chat on a bar in a pub, lean forward, roughly straight arms on your sink in your bathroom until 1/3 of your body weight is registering on the bathroom scales. And you'll notice how that is not difficult. You've got 1/3 of your body weight on a roughly locked out arm. You can do that for 10, 15 minutes if you want to. And we're flying for 5 minutes at the most. So actually, that's not a major limitation we found. It's not actually really, you know, a lot of people ask about, you know, build exoskeletons and actuators and have all these on extra arms. It gets terrifying because if all that goes wrong or locks out, your failure modes end up becoming horrifying, frankly. Whereas the benefit of using your arms is it's all light and simple and very nimble and takes about 2 days to learn to do.
And I guess that leads nicely onto the next question, which of course is people see you as an ex-Marine and clearly a very fit guy with a lot of core strength. But you're talking about quite a wide variety of people you've now brought onto these systems. What level of strength does it take to be able to fly a jetpack?
So if people really want proof of this, if you go to the Take On Gravity Instagram and you scroll down probably a dozen or so posts, you'll see my skinny 14-year-old. Who is my height now. He's about taller than me now, but he's a typical stretched out, you know, young teenager. And he flies and you can see his face and he's just the most relaxed person you can see. You're just leaning. You are simply leaning. It's a hard thing to get across until you really try it, but you are just leaning like you're leaning on that kitchen sink. You know, it's very easy for all the benefits it brings. It's just very easy. As we've had, you know, I think probably my son's the youngest to do it. Right through to 80-year-olds, men and women doing it. It's not difficult.
Oh, fantastic. So just a reminder, if you've got any further questions, please do put them on the Q&A, because I think we're probably going to have to draw to close in a minute. The time has flown by, but just please do put a message on the Q&A if you'd like to ask any further questions. So I guess we've talked about the military purposes, we've talked about mountain rescue. What other applications do you think are out there that you think you might be able to go after?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, it's worth saying again that there was no business model behind this at all. It was the joyous opportunity you don't get often in life to go and pursue something just for the joy of the challenge. The revenue streams, and we haven't raised money for 4 years, and we've got more cash in the bank than we've had in those 4 years now. And I'm quite proud of that, because actually having the idea in the first place, getting it to work is one thing, and then going and actually turning it into a self-fueling, successful commercial entity is the boring but actually pretty vital secondary challenge. So all those events around the world before COVID made us a lot of money and built a huge awareness around the world, and fueled the idea towards the RAeS series. But actually doing all the commercial activations we do, there's a lot of brands have worked with us, everything from Dell to Honda to Hyundai to Google, to all these people. If they want to manifest the spirit of innovation, we're very lucky in people thinking that we do tick that box a little, and it looks like Iron Man as well, very helpful. But actually, aside from that, yes, this sort of professionalization or professional user group is growing quite rapidly, which is quite fun. So the paramedics, special forces mobility, that's a big area. But also, I can't name where this is in the world, but I mean, there's a really interesting one emerging, which is where you've got an industrial scenario, I'll try and be cryptic about this, where human beings can't operate safely without the ability to extract themselves very quickly if an emergency arises. I'm not talking a nuclear environment or something like that, but there are mining related scenarios in the world where it turns out they're using helicopters and people on ropes, literally working for many hours a day tethered to a helicopter in case something goes wrong and the helicopter has to whisk them out of that situation. So we're working with those kind of people, because I mean, who knew that was a problem? So there are lots of niche opportunities which are very lucrative, which will add yet more fuel to our R&D journey, and to bring on things like the electric version that we showcased at Goodwood last Festival of Speed, which works. It, just like everything else, needs better batteries. But I mean, things like that have only been possible thanks to the revenue we've generated from all these different business ideas. So it's as practical as a jet ski for the consumer at the moment. It's fun. It's not a commuting vehicle. But then in terms of niche applications, there is a growing number.
I think when you, I heard you talking a couple of years ago, as I said, when we started, and you at that point you were being very careful about letting people learn to use the technology because of your concerns about, I guess, other people going off and doing things in a rather less considered way than you have. Are you still worried about that, or do you now think you've now got a sufficient training program that actually you can, if you like, let it loose and let it into the hands of the consumer?
Yeah, so people are able to race these or take these away with them, but only once they've trained with us. So you can see when people have really got this. They can demonstrate that flying up and down our zip wire system, repeatedly, and landing very precisely on very hard to land little, locations and things. And you can see this behavior. I think I mentioned it earlier, where the moment something doesn't feel right, their instinct is to flare and land. The behavior you sometimes rare, but sometimes see very early days, is people just get brain freeze and just keep gradually creeping upwards after having learned to hover. And they just, it's like you see people locking open the throttle on a quad bike into a tree or whatever. There's plenty, YouTubes of that. And you sometimes see that. That is a behavior you absolutely have to see nothing remotely resembling that when they're off the tether, because by then they're not on the remote system and they've got to sort themselves out. So that's never and will never happen. So by having the experience of, it's nearly 500 people now we've had through the training system, we are pretty good at making sure that anybody that comes off the tether is ready to do so. And even then, they're like 3 feet over the grass. So it can be very safe.
Oh, fantastic. And the last thing is, I think what testament to how successful you've been is that I haven't yet seen any sign of regulation of jetpacks. Is that something you think is coming, or are you going to successfully prove that we can work in an area without regulation?
Yeah, it's a big subject, really. So we got to know the CAA when they very graciously gave us permission to fly at the Farnborough Air Show And the conclusion then, what we do is not an aircraft because it sports no wing, although in latter years it has got that leg wing every now and then. It doesn't have a wing, and we're under 150 kilos. And we also demonstrably don't get in the way of other aircraft. We don't fly over people and property, or people or property. And we have got a bunch of ex-military pilots in the wider team who have applied a lot of rigor and kept us all safe, as I've demonstrated. But yet we reach out to the CAA, the MAA, and the FAA quite regularly just to say, hey, we're here. We're very happy to chat. Anything you're not happy with, we try to be on the front foot with this because we're very mindful of the process that has happened with drones. It wasn't that many years ago you could buy one and do what you like with it, and now there's more regulation around drones than there is us. So we're very eager to protect our reputation, and that's part of the reason why we don't sell these and just ham them out and watch what people do with them, because it'll be my personal fault and gravity's fault as soon as somebody does do something stupid. So yeah, as long as we're on the front foot with it, I think we'll be in a good place, and I think we will. I can't speak for the CAA, obviously, but I believe it's fair to say we will be around the table defining the rules when that's necessary. My worst case scenario is, and we have seen this increasingly, people do copy what we do, as is such as life now. We've seen somebody in America copying what we do, even wearing one of our T-shirts, which is bamboozling. And if he just goes and builds that, hurts himself or hurts somebody else, it's still going to be my fault, isn't it, reputationally? So that's our biggest risk, I think, trying to sort of ask the regulators to sort of get ahead of somebody else embarrassing us without us being able to mitigate that. I think that's the thing that worries me the most.
Yeah. Richard, I think our time is up. That's been absolutely fascinating, and thank you so much for such an interactive session, albeit, of course, remote these days. And so for all of you viewing, that is the end of our 34th Sir Henry Tizard lecture on reimagining human flight with Richard Browning. Richard, thank you so much for such a great lecture, and I do look forward to the point at which the committee will be able to take you out and thank you appropriately, as we normally do after this, with a meal with the committee. But thanks again, and I really wish you all the very best with the future adventure that is Gravity Industries.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to talk to you all. Thank you.
Thanks very much, everyone.